Serpent seed is a doctrine that explains the biblical account of the fall of mankind by saying the serpent had sex with Eve in the garden, and through their union bore Cain. Of course, Adam and Eve produced Abel. In this belief, the forbidden fruit is sex with the serpent. In this video, I'll use the Bible solely to make my point. No history outside of it yet. Okay, so it's worth a mention that those who subscribe to serpent seed prefer the King James Version of the Bible, KJV, or KJV, goodness. I assume this is the case because of some of the wording, maybe. Some of the wording supports their argument better, and that's the case right here with beguiled. I guess they think the word beguiled has a sexual connotation. So I guess we'll go over to the Strong's Concordance now. And this is the Hebrew word that was used in Genesis 3. What is it? In Genesis 3:13, this right here is the Hebrew word that was used. It's used 16 times throughout the Bible. It's used 12 times to mean deceive, and then you can see the other uses too. And it means to deceive, to lead astray. And that's kind of significant. No sexual connotation whatsoever. So if you believe this narrative, then you believe that the original sin was sexual in nature. I mean, I've heard it said that this is why Jesus had to be born of a virgin. Through sex, sin entered the world, so sex is therefore sinful. But God regards sex as something that is beautiful. When done within the confines of marriage between a man and a woman, yeah, it's a beautiful thing. It's like a little glimpse of the glory of God. So here's a cute verse. Proverbs 5:18 and 19. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. And there are plenty of verses that regard sex positively. Original sin was not sexual in nature. It had to do with us going against God's original command, putting ourselves on high, choosing for ourselves what is good and what is evil, pride. That is the original sin, and from that all other sins come. From the murdering of Abel out of jealousy to something like the Holocaust. It can all stem from that and that way of thinking. Anytime you have pride in your heart and just deciphering good and evil for yourself, or figuring out for yourself what you think is good and what you think is evil. So here's Genesis 3 over here, and this is where the confusion comes about. The serpent seed comes from a misinterpretation of Genesis 3. And of course I have the KJV and the NIV for cross-reference right here. And yeah, I guess they see things like they were naked, and they realized they were naked, so they had to clothe themselves, and it's supposed to be like, oh goodness, they realized they did something shameful with those parts, so they had to cover them up. And I guess it can make sense actually, but a lot of it doesn't. Like they'll say like the curse that was put on Eve right here, wherever it is. Pains in childbearing were very severe, and they use that as proof too, thinking or saying like, yeah, because she she did what she did, she'll have pain and reproduction. And there are plenty of bits in here that they can use to prove their arguments. Of course, they typically don't really regard stuff like how does this make sense? So the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife, and clothed them. And the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and live forever. And of course, the tree of life would have been both a literal tree in the garden, and the tree of life would have been God himself. And the departure from the Garden of Eden, which Eden, by the way, translates to pleasure, the exile from the garden, I guess, is like, I guess would have been like a departure from life, from God. They turn to death. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. That's what it is. It's kind of weird that they might interpret it this way. And then, of course, if you misinterpret this, then you're going to find ways to twist plenty of other verses in the Bible. And like I said, this has to do with pride. So, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil, says the serpent. And here, I'll just go to verses now. So what do I have before me? I have 1 John chapter 3, and this is used to try to prove their arguments, but these verses are not talking about a literal bloodline. So of course I go over here and you can read these itty bits. So no one who is born of God will continue to sin because God's seed remains in them. They cannot go on sinning because they have been born of God. And then verse 12, do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Of course, I didn't highlight that here because that's not really part of their narrative. As you can see, this has to do with righteousness, and probably in this specific case here, love and hatred. Okay, so it has to do with love and stuff like that. Also, it would have to do with being saved into the family of Christ. Really, if you are saved, then you are, I guess, born of God. You are one of his children, and then if you're not, then you are of the devil. So that's all this is saying, really. It's not saying anything about a bloodline, and I don't know how that is a problem, really. The bloodline stuff, people thinking like there's a good bloodline and a bad bloodline, it's just kind of scary to me. But yeah, it's conditions of the heart. Same with Matthew 13, with the parable of the weeds, and then, hey, where'd it go? And the parable of the weeds explained. All right, parable of the weeds explained. And if you just read that and you believe serpent seed, then you'll be like, oh yeah, there are evil ones and there are good ones, and it sounds like they'd be talking about a bloodline if you believe that kind of stuff, but it's not. So I'll go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. These are interesting. So of course, you may just take a quick glance at this and see virgin Eve, where is it? Beguiled Eve, serpent, oh no. And you're like, okay, well, yeah, it sounds like that, but what we have here in verse 2, Paul uses simile to compare a pure virgin to those who have held to the true gospel, or not been deceived by a false gospel, or false Jesus. Then, in verse 3, Paul goes on to say, just as Eve was deceived or led astray by the serpent, I worry that you too could be led astray by a false gospel or false Jesus. So, actually, it's quite ironic that they use this verse to prove what they believe, and it just, are you reading the context? Are you reading the meaning, or are you just like looking at some words and saying, "Oh, it's proof. Here you go." But yeah, are you looking at the meaning of what Paul meant? It's pretty significant too. It's dangerous. I just don't want people to continue on doing this kind of stuff. And I know it'll happen no matter what. Here's a little snippet of 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, and I'll just read that a little bit on the end. Having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. And you're like, corruption that is in the world through lust. Yeah, so is the NIV trying to be deceptive by changing lust into evil desires? No, to no degree is it. Lust does not have a purely sexual connotation. I mean, in today's age it seems to, but in this, the Greek word for it was, of course it was written in Greek, so the Greek word was epithemia, which epithemia meant desire, craving, longing, desire for what is forbidden, and lust. And it's not always a sexual connotation. Goodness, it's unfortunate that it's translated that way. So let's go read verse 4. Through these he has given us very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. Yeah, it's not at all talking about. It's talking about original sin. Yeah, the corruption of the world. But the original sin, not sexual in nature. And there you go. That's all there is to it. I think that's all. Yeah, that's all the verses I have with me that I have to present to you. If you contest what I have set before you, by all means, leave a comment with more verses or more proof of what you believe. I'm totally impartial to information. I strive solely for the proliferation of the truth and what is objectively, morally good. I love you so much, and I believe the serpent seed stuff is dangerous. I may not have articulated myself very well, or said things in a, I guess, understandable manner. I may have been confusing, but I just don't know what else to do. I know what else is really talking about this, and I think it changes the fabric and meaning of the Bible and what Jesus did. It's not good. And if you'd like, I can also make a video trying to explain the history of this idea and also the implications that it has. Thanks for watching.